Hey everybody, my name is Ian O'Byrne. I am Multi-Literacies Department Editor for JAAL, the Journal of Adolescent and Adult Literacy. Our latest column was on digital badges, and we looked at badges in secondary and higher ed classrooms. We looked at badges in education. And so what we wanted to do is put together a series of interviews with experts in the field to talk about some of the issues and concepts in the column. And so one of the best parts about that column, I believe, is that beautiful graphic outlining badges and metadata and all of the stuff that's, brings together a badge. And that basically, that graphic was put together by the man I'm with right now. Kyle, you want to introduce yourself?
Hello, my name is Kyle Bowen. I'm the Director of Education Technology Services at Penn State.
Very cool. Thank you for joining me. So your graphic, that basically detailed for me, and it made it easy for me to finally understand, or at least try and start to understand, what badges are all about. How do you define digital badges? What are digital badges to you?
Sure, and that's an excellent question, because essentially one of the advantages of working with digital badges is that it affords us the opportunity to define them or redefine them however we need to based on their application. But at their core, I look at it as like a common currency for learning, a way for us to begin to articulate what's been learned and how can we kind of interchange it between formats or between learning environments, allow us to recognize things that we've not had ways to recognize before. And so that definition of what is a badge, continually evolves over time. But the key component of it is that it's actually has very little to do with the badge itself, but rather the underlying components of it, or from a technical standpoint, the metadata that describes what makes up that badge. And it's that information, that nuance, that gives us opportunities that we've not had before to capture the context in which learning takes place, to capture the person that we learned it from, or the place that we learned it. These things which are important as part of that learning process, and allows us to recognize that in new ways, and helps our students be more competitive as a result.
Very cool. You talked about learning and helping our students learn, and we looked at those different contexts that they learn within. One of the things that I've been intrigued by is the way that badges have the potential to affect, to change, to modify student motivation, student engagement. Mm-hmm. How do you see badges potentially affecting or changing? How do they affect student motivation and engagement?
Sure, and that's where, for most people, that when they first come to badges, the motivational aspects are the hard sell. Because historically, badges as a motivational tool have largely been applied to things like video games, right? I kill 1,000 zombies, and as a result, I get recognized with some kind of zombie-killing badge. And the reality is that is not necessarily the type of motivation that we're looking at in this situation. For badges, really what we can do is begin to relate them very directly to learning goals, and so there's a huge body of research around how learning goals can be used to drive student motivation. And so if we begin to look at badges from that standpoint, really what we can do is begin to break them down into two kind of general categories of badges. Badges that are designed to be participatory, where just participating in something provides a certain degree of recognition, but realizing that recognition may not be as valued as other types of badges. But from a motivational standpoint, what we can do with those types of badges is begin to seed interest in new areas, so that those badges don't become the only badge you earn in that area, but rather an entry into a new field. And what we can see from learning goal theory, that we can begin to pull apart and recognize that by providing these kind of easy access on-ramps to new topics, it can actually drive motivation to want to learn more about that topic. The other area that we can look at with goals is around achievement-based badges, and this really looks at badges that correlate to specific learning outcomes or specific learning objectives, where the students completes that badge by acquiring a collection of evidence, being able to demonstrate competencies in a particular area. These are the badges that really, when we talk about teaching and learning, have some of the greatest value, because with them it brings a lot of that evidence, a lot of that information that makes it valuable. And that's part of the neat part about what these badges do, is that there is a motivational aspect to understanding or having a credential that carries with it an explicit set of values. So rather than looking at a transcript and looking at kind of an entry on a transcript, and let's say you got an A in a class, well, there's no real meaning to that A. It's that, I could have gotten any other grade, so there's nothing that defines what that A actually means. So in this case, what I'm looking at is a credential that reflects me as a student that says, okay, here's what I learned inside of this class, here's the degree to which I learned it, here is its relevancy to me in my career interests and my career trajectory and the things that are relevant in a more personalized setting. And I think that becomes the opportunity. Now, there's also another aspect of this around the engagement aspect, which is the use of badges as a way to think about instructional improvement, to begin to think about creating clear objectives for students who are entering into these kinds of learning scenarios. So where the motivational aspect becomes a clear understanding of what the learning outcomes are. Or alternatively, it can also become a choose-your-own-adventure model, where students can begin to combine badges in combinations that are flexible but at the same time more representative of the areas that they want to focus on. And so each of those plays a different part and strikes at different motivational chords, but all can be used in combinations to drive motivation in these areas. And I think that's actually a quickly emerging space of research, is to understand what are the effective combinations of these types of badges in order to drive student interest in motivation.
I like that, because it's, we say that we want a student-centered learning environment. We say we want to focus on, the interest, or, have an inquiry-based classroom, and we want to focus on what the students want to learn. But many times our assessments don't follow suit, and then when we do give grades, those grades back when I was teaching 8th grade, I would say, my students would use a term, and I'd say, well, that's a vanilla, or it's a, unclear term. Can you please color it in a little bit? Can you give more depth? So, I mean, when we talk about assessments, in our classrooms in middle school and high school, we have multiple choice tests. We have all the, the Smarter Balanced Park assessments. We have, students will write essays or maybe do a portfolio assessment. I feel like, here in higher ed, I pretty much do the same thing. I don't have, obviously, the multiple choice or the park assessments, but it's papers and portfolios, and I have alternative assessments. What value or connection do badges, or could badges, provide us in assessing students, in assessing student learning?
Sure. So I think, to begin to talk about the opportunities for assessment related to badges, really we have to start at the end of the line, which are the course outcomes. And today, for the students who engage in, who are working on a higher education, their time at the university is recognized by a transcript. And that transcript has historically been a calculation of seat time more than it has been a calculation of learning. And the problem is that those transcripts don't accurately reflect the whole of the student, or it doesn't accurately reflect what the student learned as a result of their time here. I often equate them to a receipt that you get from a store like Walmart, where it provides you kind of a cryptic description of what the item is, a unit price, and a quantity, and it uses that to kind of begin to quantify what you actually acquired at that store. And so transcripts work in a very similar way, although their return policy is a bit more strict than Walmart. But they have a more more complex meaning behind them, because the professor that you studied with may have a direct bearing on the degree of learning that you had in that class. So if you took, for example, organic chemistry from a Nobel Prize winner, that has meaning from a teaching and learning standpoint. So assessment at that level, at kind of the course level or the overall level, is important. Now, if we begin to dive into any one of those, we begin to look at new ways to structure different types of assessment, so portfolio-based assessment. And badges are, in many ways, kind of like a sneak attack on the ePortfolio model, which says that it has a lot of the same hallmarks, but what it does is it creates a structure or a framework that's a little bit easier to understand, so that for people who don't fully who don't fully understand how portfolio-based assessment works, it provides a structure to begin to kind of look at that and look at that from a learning outcomes standpoint. The other part of badges that are interesting is due to their digital nature and the digital assets that get attached to the badges, it gives us opportunities to think about forms of assessment that may have been challenging in the past. So there are areas of study where the only way to demonstrate mastery is through visual performance. And so we can think about this clearly in the arts, but then we can also think about it in terms of foreign languages or other areas where the performance of that work is a key part of assessing it. And so that because of the digital nature of these badges, we can begin to tie those types of visual assessments to the resulting credential itself, and so that they're explicitly linked as opposed to being implicitly linked. And I think, again, that relates back to kind of the previous question around motivation, is that I can begin to understand these assignments, these things that I'm working on, these projects in the classroom, and the things I'm producing as a result. It has a direct tie or direct relationship to the ending credential that recognizes that work.
And I don't want to speak for the students, but there's the possibility of them looking at those assessments and then actually earning that badge as being more meaningful, as opposed to that Walmart receipt and looking at, all right, I spent my 13 weeks with you. I was here 3 hours a night. I did my 4 or 5 papers. Okay, I can pass on, and I pass on to something else. Did I actually learn something? No, I pretty much I bide my time until the end of the trimester.
Yeah, and that's an excellent point, because there are areas where your learning is a culmination or a progression, and so to understand and recognize the value in that kind of early formative stage and how that relates to where you ended up, that in itself is a learning process, and I can begin to reflect on how did I learn or how did I perform during that period of time. And so it not only becomes a direct insight into how I'm being assessed in those particular areas, but rather how am I adapting to these areas, or how am I maturing as a learner? How am I learning to learn? And what adjustments can I make as I go? And because badges provide that kind of transparency and they stack one to another, that I can begin to see that progression. So it's not as simple as trying to remember back, what did it look like when I took that 100 level version of this class versus where I'm at in this 400 level. But in this case, what we're doing is creating an explicit continuum that says, no, here's where you started and here's where you are at now. And it helps the student understand, one, how they're progressing, but then two, from an institutional perspective, we can begin to help the student understand here is their progression versus our expectation of them. And so it no longer looks at a course level assessment, but rather looks at a sub-course level. I've had a number of really interesting conversations with faculty around the idea that it's entirely possible to pass a course but not meet all of its learning outcomes. And we've all probably experienced that. So anybody who's gotten a C in a class has kind of experienced that firsthand. And so because it's not possible to only pass parts of a course. The other part of it is that courses are based on are really based on a course clock, right? That we set an arbitrary length of time, 15 weeks in many cases, that say, okay, it's our expectation that you be able to learn this material in this amount of time. And at the end, we assess the student based on their progression versus time. But in reality, maybe it takes me longer. Maybe I want to explore parts of this more. So it should really be that at the end of that period of time, it's more a check and a progress report that says, okay, here's where you're at. You're operating at, let's say, C level. To get to a mastery level, these are the areas that you need to improve in. And so that we begin to look at, from a competency-based standpoint, how do we help students actually acquire the skills and knowledge that we want them to have.
And I think it's important as we look at, as opposed to one class, we look at programs. We look at growth over time, and it's, if you're here for a year or longer, are you growing over time? Are we, as faculty, sequencing instruction? Are we looking at building, knowledge, skills, and dispositions over time? Badges might provide one example or one way to, document that learning over time. But it's not the only one. And the beauty, I think the beauty of badges is that, if you have that reflective element built in, and the transparency, so everyone can see what you reflected on as you applied for the badge or were awarded the badges. You can see my reflections and my assessment of you. And so other people that are not involved in that transaction, they can look at it and be like, okay, now I know what I have to do to earn a badge from from Ian or from Kyle.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, you're in higher ed. What could we be doing in higher education with badges? What could and should we be doing now with badges? And probably more importantly for people that are out there that are instructors in higher ed, how do you start?
Sure, sure. So when we begin to think about badges and really their versatility, they're this kind of Swiss Army knife of credential that we can begin to apply in many different places. And it's important to think about badges in terms of how they relate to the existing academy. So what we don't want to do is present this narrative where the only way to engage in kind of the creation issue of badges is to stop doing everything else and start doing badges, but rather badges, because of their versatility, we can retrofit them into the existing academy. So many of these processes already exist. So many of these ideas already exist. And it's just a matter of beginning to apply a new kind of thinking in many of these areas. And so what I begin to look at is that there are 4 emergent component areas where badges begin to have application that again, fit into how many institutions already operate today. There are curricular badges, so these are badges that are being embedded inside of courses, in many cases in an attempt to clarify, recognize specific learning outcomes inside of the course. The value of this is that for students who progress through a course, that through their coursework they can demonstrate or differentiate themselves as part of the actual work being done, so that all the students in the class who got an A, for example, there's this kind of implicit connection that says, well, all of those students did the same thing. But in reality, students may have specialized in particular areas, done particularly well in certain things that are more relevant to their career interests, that it provides them a way to create that transparency and really begin to credential and recognize what they're doing inside of those classes. In addition to curricular work, what we're looking at is there's the cross-curricular aspect. So these are learning outcomes that happen as a result of the collection of assessments or outcomes in a multitude of courses. So rather than having one course that teaches you all of a particular topic, rather you might pick up that in multiple different courses. So I've seen this having been done with intercultural awareness. So if you think about intercultural awareness as a very complex topic that has multiple different aspects, rather than teaching one class on intercultural awareness, rather that outcomes can be embedded in a series of courses that, as collected over time, begin to result in a credential that recognizes that combination of skills that have been acquired. And so it gives greater flexibility to programs and to the university to be able to be creative about how they're embedding these different ideas, and then again provides additional support or recognition to the student that they're actually developing, capturing some of these outcomes. In addition to those 2 aspects, there are also much more open ways of looking at badges as well. So one of those is looking at co-curricular aspects. So currently in many institutions, there's no real official recognition of a co-curricular activity. And some have adopted what co-curricular transcripts or something very similar, which begins to look at this type of concept. But in reality, what we need is a way to recognize learning in all of its forms. And that has to include learning that takes place outside of the classroom. And so for our students that are really engaging in their educational experience, that are really kind of sucking the marrow out of their time at the university, how do we help recognize that learning that takes place? So if they're participating as part of a student government, if they're participating as part of a very progressive kind of research activity, engaged in undergraduate research and other areas like that, I mean, these are all things that are hallmarks of highly successful students. But yet we don't provide a structured recognition of their contributions or of their achievements in these spaces. And so that's another place where badges begin to take part. And then there's a fourth component element, which is really looking at open curricular aspects. So this is open learning that takes place anywhere that is credentialed, maybe by the institution, by other institutions. So this is for students that, for example, are taking a MOOC and they successfully complete the MOOC and they get recognized as part of that. That the creation of those credentials becomes a way to recognize student learning in other areas or recognize student learning that is acquired from other locations or other institutions. And a key part of this can also be the use of those open curricular credentials as part of partial completion in a curricular sense. So I've taken this online course, I've completed these assessments, I've completed coursework in these areas. The credentials I earn from that can then be applied to 4-credit courses or curricular-based activities at some point in the future. So it can, again, playing again on that motivational aspect of the open curricular aspect can be the on-ramp to a new area of interest, and but I don't have to start completely over. That I can use these elements, this prior learning that I already have, and begin to apply it going forward. And so each one of these 4 areas has in itself kind of its own advantages and disadvantages. But the reality is that because of the versatility of the badges, we can begin to mold it to work into each one of these areas. And the other advantage that we have is that most institutions already understand these concepts, are already embracing this in many different ways. And so it's just a matter of how do we begin to apply the transparency and structure of a micro-credentialed environment to those existing activities. And I think that is the path forward. And so from a curricular stance, so for faculty that are thinking about developing badges as part of their courses, maybe a key part of that is to think about what are the learning outcomes or what are the competencies that are built as part of those classes. What is the evidence that results that comes about as results of those activities, and then use the badges as a way to recognize that. And I think once we begin to have a lot of kind of research and development and innovation around this kind of thinking, as faculty begin to apply their own creativity to different models of applying badges, that's the point at which we begin to hit critical mass. And I think, like motivation, the uses or applications of digital badges are, again, another emergent form or emergent area of research to understand what are the most effective applications of badges right now. Because the reality is it's a very new area. We can't easily say, well, this is the best use or this is the most effective use, but rather, there are many different uses. And so part of it is to explore each one and understand what its implications are. But I think from higher education standpoint, by looking at the things that institutions already do, already understand, and beginning to fit badges into that workflow, that provides us a kind of workable path forward where we don't have to destroy things or build all kinds of stuff, but rather we can take these ideas and begin to fit them into these existing processes in such a way that we can begin to understand them better.
I think it's one of the important pieces in higher ed, or also K-12, is it's got to come back to the learning objectives and the learning outcomes. Why are kids in your seats, either in hybrid or face-to-face, wherever they are? If they're outside of the classroom, what are those learning objectives? What do you want to highlight? So I thank you for the time. If people have questions for you, want to reach out to you, I know that you're busy on Twitter. How can they get in touch with you if they're watching this and they say, okay, I want to get right in touch with Kyle and ask him some questions?
Sure, absolutely. They can connect with me at Twitter. I'm at Kyle D. Bowen, or you can visit my website at classhack.com, or feel free to email me at kbowen@psu.edu.
I'll put all that info up on the blog post from this. Last words.
I think really the great opportunity, and I said it before and I want to reiterate it again, is that learning takes very many forms at our institutions, and badges, due to their versatility, can really help us begin to help us recognize our students. The comparison I usually make is if we think about kind of those books, Where's Waldo? But in this case, what we want to do is how do we find the Waldos amongst all of the other Waldos, and how do we help our students really kind of differentiate themselves and demonstrate their specific abilities and their contributions that they can make. And that's really the most exciting part of this.
Well said. So with that, this is a series that we're putting together. These are interviews that go along with the multi-literacies department columns that we're putting together. This latest one was on badges. So we urge you to watch this, read the column, get involved in the discussion, try out badges in your classroom. There are a lot of resources out there. The badging community is very helpful and very supportive. There's a lot of people that want you to try this out as well in your classroom. So with that being said, we'll wrap up.